So we are delighted to have representatives here from our international community. And there are many of you from different countries that have come up to me. Thank you so much for being here. I had the privilege of meeting Ambassador Hillman several months ago when perhaps the landscape was not as certain as it is today, and perhaps there was more unrest about the future of relationships. And how was the NAFTA agreement going to be modified, and what did the future look like? On a personal and professional level, I've traveled to Canada many times, and I've been very fortunate to do so recreationally and do so in my official capacity as either a mayor or Secretary of Commerce for Virginia. And I don't think that we have any better friend in this hemisphere. We are very, very fortunate to have Canada and the strong relationships between us. I'm excited that Ambassador Hillman is here. She is going to talk a little bit about the Canada-Virginia relationship, maybe touch on the new agreement, and where we go from here. She has held distinguished positions in the past. Her bio is in your packet, but I just want to point out that she's been involved at the highest level of negotiations for the country, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, as we refer to it, and many others. She's a graduate of University of Manitoba and also a law degree from McGill University. Please join me in thanking and welcoming a Virginia welcome for Ambassador Kirsten Hillman. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you for that kind welcome. It is a real pleasure to be back in Richmond, and I'd like to thank the team for inviting me here to this important event. I was looking at your agenda for these sessions, and I thought there probably could be nothing more relevant than what you're talking about here today. And I was lucky enough to hear most of the last session as well. And I was struck by the fact that the kinds of things that you're thinking about and talking about here are the similar kinds of things that we're talking about in Canada, which is attracting talent and how to be sure that we get the right skills to the right people at the right time, and how we make sure that in this environment of ever-changing commercial landscape that we are as competitive as we possibly can be. In that light, I actually think that it's very useful and helpful to be talking about our relationship between Canada and the United States in particular. Commercially, we're neighbors, we're friends, we're allies. I was just recounting the story that in my personal life, my family had a country home, a cottage on a lake, little thing, shack of a cottage, but was wonderful to me. And that lake was in southern Manitoba on the border of Manitoba and North Dakota, 1/3 of which was in Canada, 2/3 of which was in the United States. And I spent my summers water skiing back and forth between our two countries all day long. I hadn't the slightest idea that I was crossing an international border. And to me that represents, I've been in Washington for a year now. I've had the pleasure and privilege of crossing the country and talking to all sorts of people. And one of the things that is clear is that, you know, I can go nowhere where somebody doesn't say, oh, well, my wife is Canadian, my cousin, my neighbor, my son's nephew's dog. Everybody has a connection in some way. And I think that that's the core to the strength of the relationship that we have. So with all of those warm and fuzzy opening remarks, I guess what I'd like to say is it has been actually kind of a challenging time between our two countries on the trade front for the past year. We are in a better place, and I will spend some time talking about the USMCA, which is the new acronym for the NAFTA. Not as easily rolling off the tongue, but I'm sure 10 years from now we'll take that acronym for granted. But before I do, I would actually like to take a little bit of time to talk about the Canada-Virginia relationship, the commercial relationship, and give you some examples. You know, what happens in the boardrooms of the United States Trade Representative or the White House or our Prime Minister's office when we are trying to negotiate these deals is one thing. But it is really what matters is what the rules that we then create mean for the people on the ground here in Virginia, in our towns and communities, and how those rules, as a government official, what we're doing, how it really makes a difference. So I'm going to start explaining that through the listing of some statistics, and you'll forgive me, don't worry, it's not going to last long, but I do want to give you some understanding of the scope of the relationship. So the first thing is that Canada is Virginia's #1 customer. You sell more to Canada than you sell to China and to Mexico combined. And China and Mexico are your second and your third largest export markets. The trade between our two countries tilts in Virginia's favor. Generally speaking, in other words, you sell more to us than we sell to you by about $1 billion a year. On the tourism front, which is another large aspect of our relationship, I think it's fair to say Canadians love Virginia. I'm sure many, many people do, but we had nearly 700,000 visits to Virginia by Canadians last year, which contributed about $217 million to your economy. In my household, I can say that in particular, my sons and my husband played their part on the craft beer front. On the oyster front, and I myself have to admit that I did generate some Virginia revenues through wine consumption. So we're doing our bit as well. In terms of investment, there are more than 200 Canadian-owned businesses with a presence in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and some of the names that you might be familiar with are BlackBerry, CGI, Santec, and TD Bank. Then there are companies that export from Virginia. Close to 300,000 jobs in Virginia depend on exports to Canada from the Commonwealth. But those are just numbers, right? And so I think what's important is to try and humanize that a bit by giving some examples. I just met Ross Butler, who is the CEO of Cook Seafood. And Cook Seafood has operations in Atlantic Canada and in Virginia and in Maine, and they employ 400 individuals here. We also have Virginia's top export to Canada, which is road tractors for semi-trailers. In Dublin, Volvo manufactures all the trucks for the North American market, as probably many of you know. Of those trucks that are manufactured, $280 million worth, or 20% of their production, is exported to Canada. So this is a significant relationship that enables hundreds of jobs around the Dublin area. And if you go further down the road, you come to the picturesque town of Lebanon, where I'm sure many of you have been or know, and we have a number of Canadian companies that are there creating important jobs. In fact, Canadian companies are some of the top employers in the region. CGI, which is a large Canadian systems integrator, employs over 400 people. And the Samuel Pressure Vessel Group, which is a Canadian company that manufactures pressure valve tanks, employs another 260 people. But one of the things that I learned in preparing to come and talk to you today is that these companies are not only employers, right? They are deeply integrated into the fabric of communities. They are deeply integrated into the places where they live. And I was learning that they do a lot of good work in their communities, from supporting local schools, purchasing wrestling mats, I hear, also, covering the costs of some educational experiences and materials in the local community, contributing to the Christmas celebrations and helping those in need. And this gets back to my comments about me, water skiing back and forth between our two countries. At some level, I think we almost don't distinguish between ourselves and those of us who are from the other country living and working within our communities, because our values and our interests and our sense of community and caring for our communities is very similar. So I'm looking at my little clock here, and it's ticking down, which is a little bit, I feel I'm going to need to move on a little bit more quickly than planned to talk a little bit about the USMCA. Maybe just before I do that, though, one of the things, and this just to finish off on my theme of Canada-US cooperation, Canada-US partnership, and integration. I've talked about companies that sort of sell back and forth. But what we do more than anything, and I'm sure most of you know this better than I, is that we operate supply chains together. We use products from one country or the other to up our competitiveness in order to have a reliable, affordable, secure partner with whom we can do businesses, or our businesses can do business with each other. And I think that in this moment in time, when the competitiveness edge that we need in order to ensure that our countries and our communities are able to compete in an ever-increasing marketplace of innovation, competition, difficult challenges with the way in which the business community and what we're doing in manufacturing has evolved, we need to rely more than ever on those partnerships. And it's for that reason that we are particularly happy at this moment in time for the fact that we were successfully able to conclude negotiations on the USMCA. So let me tell you just a little bit about how those negotiations went, some of the outcomes, and what I think it will mean for all of us. So it was a very intense set of negotiations. As somebody who has done trade negotiations for most of my career, I can tell you that that kind of process usually takes 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 years, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve and how many countries you have at the table. We achieved a complete renegotiation of the agreement, or a renegotiation of the areas that we were interested in modernizing and improving, in less than 14 months, which is breakneck speed for international relations and for government rulemaking in general. I probably don't need to tell you that. But we have an agreement that came out with 34 chapters. We made a lot of progress in getting a lot of the negotiations done by the spring, and then over the course of the summer, we had, and into September, we had some of the toughest issues that we grappled with between Canada and Mexico, Mexico and the US and Canada. We all had different issues that were important as between us, and we grappled with those, and we were able to come to a conclusion at the end of last month. And it was really a very constructive, a very intense, hardworking commitment on all three sides. There's a lot of discussion of this particular negotiation. It was more public than I've ever seen anything like this before, and what I can tell you is that at that negotiating table, with not only our technical negotiators, but our political leadership, it was clear that everybody was trying to swim in the same direction. Everybody was trying to enhance and improve this relationship. So when the negotiations started, Canada went in with essentially 4 goals. First, we wanted to preserve the important elements of this partnership, which is almost complete tariff-free trade between our 3 countries. To integrate, to privilege, to enhance cooperation. Secondly, we absolutely had to update the agreement, right? So for Canada, on Canada's side, we have an agreement with the Europeans, and we are part of the what is now called the CPTPP, or the TPP. And both of those agreements, plus a few others that we've negotiated in recent years, are very modern. They include chapters on digital commerce, international competition law, anti-corruption and international dealings, things that are really relevant, data localization, data rules, really relevant to the way the world works today, but don't exist in the current NAFTA because the current NAFTA is 25 years old. So our second big goal was to ensure that the agreement that was the most important for our economic well-being and for the US and Mexico also, the agreement that is with our biggest trading partners in the world, was somehow not 25 years old when the framework we were using with other partners was up to date. So updating it was very important. And updating it is also about, frankly, kind of getting government out of the way, ensuring that the borders are freer for the purposes of commerce, trying to get some of the kinds of regulations that were prevalent in past years in the red tape 25 years ago that was relevant, that needed to be articulated in an agreement like this, could be streamlined. So that was an important endeavor that we all shared as an objective. The thing that was very important to Canada was to update the agreement to make it more relevant to a broader audience of our constituents in Canada. It's no secret that when trade is discussed publicly within our communities, there are some people who believe that the promise of international trade hasn't really been met for them, that they feel that there is something in international competition that has left them somewhat behind. And I think that that is a real sentiment that exists in all of our countries, and so for us it was very important to try to. There are many ways in which to address that sentiment. Some of them can be done in a trade agreement, some of them have to be done outside, but to the extent that that was possible within the renegotiated NAFTA, that was a goal for us. So we have some interesting provisions on promoting wage growth for the middle class, and this is if you follow these kinds of things, a lot of this comes out of the automotive commitments that have been made. We also have, an entire chapter on small and medium-sized enterprises and trying to make sure that the benefits of the trade agreement flow down to these smaller enterprises, which for all three countries are actually quantitatively the drivers of our economy. And finally, for Canada, it was essential to have a rules-based framework. So if we're going to enter into all of these rules, we need to make sure that they're enforceable. We need to make sure that our companies can count on them. We need to make sure that we're creating stability in the marketplace. And we did it. We achieved all of those objectives. We have an agreement that ensures duty-free access for the vast majority of NAFTA goods, maintains all of the openness that the NAFTA provided, reinforces North American supply chains through simpler rules, both rules of origin, which are the rules that you use to determine whether or not you're going to get the tariff preference of an agreement, but also rules at the border, the kinds of things I was talking about, streamlining border processes, modernizing them. We preserved very important elements of the original NAFTA with respect to enforceability and dispute settlement. Both Canada and Mexico got an exemption from any future tariffs in the area of autos that could be brought forward by the U.S. administration. And we have all sorts of new chapters on digital commerce and telecommunications and, as I say, small and medium-sized enterprises, labor, environment have been updated significantly. So very important outcomes. And there was strong creative thinking on all sides. There was a common will on all sides. And I think that it served us not only in the commitments that we were able to achieve, but also in a renewed understanding of the importance of this partnership between our countries, of the degree to which we are mutually interdependent, but also mutually supportive. So I guess what I'd like to say in sort of the last part of my remarks is that we have made, this was an incredibly important achievement to put ourselves into a modernized NAFTA, to reestablish some stability and certainty for our business community with respect to these negotiations, but we still have some work to do. And specifically, we still have some work to do with respect to the tariffs that remain in place on steel and aluminum as between our two countries. So as people I think probably know, the U.S. imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on some aluminum products coming from Canada and Mexico and other countries around the world, under the guise, under a provision that is used for the protection of national security. And that was quite difficult for Canadians to understand. Here in the United States, I'm responsible for the Canadians who live in this United States, and that includes over 2,000 of our armed forces who are based all across this country, defending, the sky and the waters of the North American homeland. And these men and women, come from the community that has stood beside and fought with and died with their American counterparts through both world wars in Afghanistan and Korea and elsewhere. And having this kind of a measure taken on the grounds that Canada posed a national security threat to the United States was something that's very, very difficult for me to be able to explain, not only to the Canadians that I am responsible for here in the United States, but to Canadians at home. And that hasn't been easy. And importantly as well, it actually makes no real economic sense, and I think you hopefully would agree with me on that. Canada is the biggest market for U.S. steel. We purchase more steel from the U.S. than any other country. In fact, from every other country combined. So what happened was when these tariffs were put in place and the aluminum tariffs were put in place, our government really had no choice but to say, okay, well, we are going to have to also put in place countermeasures. And they, on a dollar for dollar basis, the exact same dollar value, have imposed tariffs on U.S. products. And this goes counter to exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be doing exactly the opposite thing. The costs to our manufacturers, the costs to our consumers, our ability to be competitive in the international marketplace is greatly hampered by this dynamic that we have on those products. So I guess I'd like to, I started off very positive, talking about water skiing and all that happy stuff. And I'm going to have to end on a more serious note, unfortunately. And I'm happy to go back to happy after. But I would like to say, and I say this in all seriousness, we're not done yet. We have to get to a place where those tariffs can be removed from both sides. And it will have to be done together. It won't happen, you know, you guys first, and then us first, and then you. It has to be done together. So I would urge you, as the leaders of the business community of this very successful and very prosperous and very impressive state, to speak to your political leadership and to explain to them the impacts that this is having on your businesses. And I know it's having, and my red light is flashing, so I can't go into the research and that my team has presented to me about how the costs of aluminum, you know, has impacted a number of manufacturers in Virginia. Steel, obviously, is a major component in the production of most manufactured goods. And then the countermeasures affect a wide swath of sectors across the state. So I would urge you, please, to, if this is something that is having an effect on you and on your businesses, to let your lawmakers know and to help us get the right conditions in place so that we can do the very best that we can for our businesses on both sides of the border. And I think with that, which is kind of not as fun, but I'd like to come back to happy and positive again. It's a great time for our two countries. We have smart, dynamic, motivated, you know, amazing populations. We have natural resources and geography that gives us an advantage that most of our partners around the world can never even dream of. We have an integrated culture of business and we have an integrated set of values. There is nothing that can stop us from being, you know, another 10 times more successful than we are now together. So I look forward to helping move to the phase where we are looking very much to the future and doing that. Thank you very much.